Marcus Johnson had always found solace in airports. The constant buzz of people moving from one place to another, the hum of announcements, the occasional clink of coffee cups, it all created a rhythm that he had grown used to over the years. At 64, Marcus had spent more time traveling than most people could ever dream of. As a world-renowned legal advisor to the United Nations, his work had taken him to countless countries, dealing with high-stakes cases and advising on some of the world's most pressing human rights issues. But today, he was just another passenger. He stood in the business-class queue at JFK International Airport, a slim leather carry-on bag in one hand, a paperback book in the other. His shoulders were relaxed, his eyes scanning the pages. Marcus wasn't in a rush. He had no reason to be. His flight to Geneva was delayed by 30 minutes, and for the first time in a while, he had nothing on his mind but the book in his hands. His appearance didn't draw much attention. He was a tall man, well-dressed in a navy wool trench coat, gray trousers, and a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard. Despite the years of international travel, there was a modest air about him. He wasn't here to make a statement, but to simply pass through the airport unnoticed, like any other traveler. His phone remained in his hand, but it wasn't buzzing with notifications. He wasn't scrolling through social media or checking emails. His focus was on a court transcript he had been reviewing, a war crimes case that had left him reflecting long after he left the tribunal in The Hague. Unbeknownst to Marcus, he was about to become the center of attention, but for all the wrong reasons. Across the terminal, near the large windows that overlooked the runway, Rebecca Sinclair sat with her husband, Thomas. A woman in her mid-50s with sharp blonde hair and diamond stud earrings, Rebecca was the kind of traveler who never left home without being impeccably dressed. She was quick to correct flight attendants and even quicker to comment on the quality of service. But today, her gaze wasn't on the flight attendants or the planes outside. It was fixed on Marcus. Rebecca had noticed him the moment he'd stepped into the queue. He was too still, too composed, too different from the usual hurried travelers around him. Everyone else seemed busy, focused on their phones or watching the gates, but Marcus stood there, almost like he was waiting for something. Or perhaps, just waiting for nothing. His calmness, his lack of movement, set something off in her. It bothered her, but she couldn't exactly explain why. "That man," she whispered to Thomas, her voice low but certain. "The one in the long coat. Something's wrong with him." Thomas barely glanced up from his phone. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. He's just too calm, too quiet. He's been watching everyone," Rebecca muttered. "It's unsettling." Her eyes narrowed as she leaned toward the gate attendant, who was busy scanning tickets. "I don't know what it is, but you need to report him," she said with authority, almost as if issuing a command. "He's making people uncomfortable. I feel it." The gate attendant looked confused but nodded. "Ma'am, he's just in line like everyone else. He cleared security." "I know what I feel," Rebecca replied sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Just report it, please, before it's too late." Without another word, the attendant picked up the phone and made the call. At 7:36 a.m., two officers near Gate B16 received the radio message. A suspicious passenger had been identified, a man in his mid-60s, possibly casing the area. No visible threat yet, but enough of a concern to warrant a closer look. The officers were quick to act. Daniel Matthews, a young officer with a sense of confidence that bordered on arrogance, cracked his knuckles as he stood up. Beside him, his partner, James Carter, an older officer who preferred to follow than lead, gave him a quiet nod. They had no idea who this man was, but they didn't need to ask. It was their job to investigate, and that was exactly what they intended to do. As Marcus moved forward in line, ready to present his passport and ID, he noticed the officers standing nearby. Their eyes were fixed on him. But instead of reacting, he simply turned to face them, his expression calm, almost as if he had been expecting them. He had always been the kind of man who carried himself with quiet authority, but today, that calm would become a focal point of misunderstanding. "Sir," Officer Matthews said, his voice firm and clipped, "we need to speak with you." Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't flinch. "About?" he asked, his tone even. "We've received a complaint," Officer Carter interjected. "You've been making other passengers uncomfortable." Marcus blinked once, his eyes not leaving theirs. "I see," he replied. "And what exactly am I suspected of?" "We need to check your bag," Matthews cut in, stepping forward. "Step out of line." A few nearby passengers turned their heads. Some subtly shifted their phones into position, preparing to record. A mother pulled her toddler closer to her, uncertain about the situation. But Marcus, unfazed, stepped aside without a hint of fear. He wasn't worried. He simply knew this moment was inevitable. "My name is Dr. Marcus Johnson," he said, his voice clear. "I'm a legal advisor to the United Nations Human Rights Council. I've cleared every international checkpoint required." Matthews looked at him with a blank stare. "We're just doing our job," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "We'll need to review your bags, sir." Marcus remained calm. "Am I under arrest?" he asked, his voice low. "No, but your cooperation is required." "Then I would like your badge numbers," Marcus replied, his gaze steady. It was in that moment, as his rights were spoken aloud in a public space, that the shift began. The power dynamic was now out in the open. Matthews bristled, stepping closer into Marcus' space. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Marcus didn't move. "There's only one lawful way," he said, his words measured and firm. The officers hesitated for a moment. But before they could respond, the snap of cold metal echoed through the terminal. The sound of handcuffs being clicked into place rippled through the crowd, and gasps spread across the waiting area. Marcus Johnson, a world-renowned UN legal advisor, was now in handcuffs, not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked, how he was perceived. And so, the story began. The scene at JFK quickly turned into a spectacle. Marcus Johnson, a man who had dedicated his life to defending human rights on a global scale, was now being escorted through the terminal in handcuffs. The officers, Matthews and Carter, walked on either side of him, their hands gripping his arms harder than necessary. The crowd watched, some in confusion, others with their phones raised to capture the moment. But amidst all the whispers and murmurs, Marcus remained unshaken. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. His mind was already cataloging every detail of this encounter, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The moment was not about him. It was about what the officers represented, an unchecked system that had long been allowed to operate under assumptions, prejudices, and silent power. The walk to the security office felt long, but Marcus didn't rush it. The hallways were eerily quiet, filled with an uncomfortable silence that seemed to echo his every step. Officer Carter kept his eyes on the ground, uncomfortable with the growing attention, while Matthews strode forward confidently, leading the way, unaware of the irony of it all. A world-renowned UN legal advisor was in handcuffs, being led through the halls of an airport, as if he were the criminal. As they neared the security office, Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady. "I would like a lawyer present," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air. Matthews didn't reply immediately. He just pushed open the door to the small, dimly lit room, where the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. It wasn't much, just a few metal chairs and a cold desk. But to Marcus, it was a symbol of something much larger, something far more sinister, a system of power that sought to control those who refused to conform. "Sit," Matthews ordered. Marcus took his seat slowly, deliberately. The cuffs dug into his wrists, but he didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, his eyes sharp. Officer Carter stood near the corner, his arms crossed, his face tight with discomfort. There was a sense of unease in the air, a flicker of doubt in Carter's eyes that Matthews seemed to ignore. It was subtle, but it was there. Carter wasn't sure if they were doing the right thing anymore. The silence in the room wasn't empty. It was filled with something far more powerful than fear. It was the truth. Unspoken, but undeniable. "State your name," Matthews barked, his voice a little too harsh, a little too eager to prove his authority. "You have my identification," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm Marcus Johnson, legal advisor to the United Nations, specializing in human rights law. I have worked with tribunals around the world, most recently in The Hague." Matthews didn't even look up from his clipboard. He scribbled something down, muttering under his breath. "Possible alias." Carter's gaze flickered toward Marcus again, this time longer. Something in his face shifted, recognition, perhaps, or maybe the realization that they had been far too hasty in their assumptions. But neither officer questioned him. They simply continued with their process, as if the facts didn't matter, as if they had already made their decision about who Marcus was. "What exactly am I being detained for?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but firm, a quiet rebuke wrapped in dignity. "We received a complaint," Matthews said, his voice tinged with frustration. "Suspicious behavior. You were seen watching people's bags." Marcus didn't blink. "Do you mean sitting with my own luggage?" he asked calmly. Matthews waved his hand dismissively. "We'll be reviewing the footage shortly." "Did you know," Marcus continued, "that I've already cleared passport control and TSA? No flags. No problems." "Doesn't matter," Matthews replied, brushing him off. "That was before we received the report." A report based on whose assessment? Marcus inquired. What made you so sure I was guilty? The question hung in the air, heavy with truth. Matthew's eyes narrowed as he tried to mask his discomfort. Carter shifted again, his unease growing as he looked down at his partner. You're getting defensive, sir, Matthews said, a note of irritation creeping into his voice. Makes you look guilty. Guilty of what? Marcus asked, his voice low. Of reading in silence? The words hit Matthews like a punch to the gut. They stung because, on some level, he knew it was true. Marcus wasn't guilty of anything other than existing in a space where people like him weren't supposed to. His calmness, his stillness, became the crime in their eyes. Carter's hands twitched at his sides, unsure of where to place them. His earlier confidence was slipping away, replaced with uncertainty. In a courtroom, this would have been the first crack, the first sign that something was wrong. But here, in this sterile room, it was the only sign. And Marcus saw it. He took a deep breath. I'm not angry, he said softly. I'm not fighting you. I just want to know why this is happening. Why I'm being treated like this. But Matthews wasn't listening anymore. His eyes were fixed on his tablet, scrolling through the footage from the terminal. We'll get to the bottom of this, he muttered, his voice low and distant. The minutes dragged on, and as the silence stretched longer, the reality of the situation began to set in. Outside the small security room, the world was moving on. People were boarding their flights, catching their trains, carrying on with their lives. But inside this room, time seemed to stop. And Marcus, though physically restrained, had never felt freer. The truth was his ally now, and it had a way of shifting everything. And then, as if on cue, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Another knock at the door. This time, it wasn't another officer. It was someone who carried a different kind of authority. The door to the small, dimly lit security room opened again, but this time, it wasn't an officer entering. It was a man in a sleek black overcoat, holding a silver ID badge in his hand. His presence was immediate, calm yet commanding. He approached the door with purpose, his sharp gaze fixed on Marcus, as if he already knew exactly who he was. Carter and Matthews exchanged a brief glance. Neither seemed to know what to make of the new arrival. Can I help you? Matthews asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. The man didn't hesitate. Agent Declan Rodas, he said, his voice smooth but firm. International Legal Oversight Division. He flashed his badge at Matthews, who still seemed confused but was growing increasingly aware of the situation's gravity. Declan stepped forward, his posture straight and his expression resolute. You're detaining a United Nations-affiliated legal officer without jurisdiction or grounds, Declan continued, his voice calm but unyielding. That ends now. Matthews's face flushed, his confidence faltering as he realized that something much bigger was unfolding right under his nose. Declan's presence was enough to throw him off balance, but it was the mention of the UN and the authority behind the words that truly shook him. We're conducting an internal investigation, Matthews stammered, though the words didn't seem to hold any weight now. Declan didn't flinch. You're conducting an unlawful detainment, he said, his tone sharp. We've already been contacted by the U.S. Consulate, Interpol, and the Hague's Emergency Oversight Desk. You are holding a man who trains judges on the Geneva Conventions. And now, you'll be releasing him. The room went silent. It wasn't just a silence of confusion, it was the silence of realization. Declan's words carried a weight that none of them had anticipated. Carter stood frozen in place, staring at Marcus as if he were seeing him for the first time. Matthews, on the other hand, stood rigid, his mouth slightly agape, his mind racing to catch up. Declan turned toward Marcus, his gaze softening for a brief moment. We've confirmed your identity, Mr. Johnson, he said, and we are prepared to escort you under international protocol. Marcus, who had remained composed throughout the entire ordeal, nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, his voice steady, not out of anger or relief, but simply as if this was another day in a long line of battles. But I do require documentation. I need a full report and badge numbers. The calm authority in Marcus's voice only heightened the discomfort in the room. Matthews, despite his earlier bluster, was now clearly rattled. He stepped forward, his hands shaking slightly as he removed the cuffs from Marcus's wrists. The snap of metal being released seemed louder than it should have been, and it felt like the room itself breathed a collective sigh of relief. I apologize, sir, Carter muttered, his voice thick with embarrassment. He fumbled with the cuffs, unsure of how to proceed, but Marcus simply looked at him, his expression neither angry nor forgiving, just an acknowledgement that the moment had passed. Marcus didn't rush to leave. He didn't speak in haste or with fury. His silence, his calmness, spoke volumes. He met Carter's eyes for a moment, and the unspoken understanding between them was clear. Carter had made a mistake. But Marcus wasn't here to punish. He wasn't here for revenge. He was here for something greater. I know this was not personal, Marcus said quietly, his voice cutting through the air with clarity. But this system of assumptions, of profiling, needs to be examined. It needs to change. And you, both of you, he gestured toward the officers, you're part of that system. Matthews's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. The truth was out there now, like a shadow that couldn't be ignored. Declan stood back, waiting for Marcus to move. Mr. Johnson, whenever you're ready, he said, his voice now holding a subtle respect for the man in front of him. Marcus rose from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't hurry. The officers stepped aside, their heads down, but Marcus didn't look back. He knew this wasn't over, not for him, and certainly not for them. As he walked out of the room, Declan followed him, giving a brief nod to the officers. They stood there, frozen, as the door clicked shut behind them. But before Marcus reached the hallway, he turned back, his calm voice filling the space. You've done your part, he said to Declan. Now it's up to them. Let's make sure they don't forget. The hallway outside the security room felt different now. It wasn't just the quiet, the tension that had clung to the air for so long, it was the anticipation of what was to come. The moment Marcus stepped into the open terminal, the eyes of the world were already on him. His arrest had gone viral. Phones had captured the scene, and the footage spread quickly, leaving an indelible mark on the airport's calm routine. But Marcus didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look for approval or sympathy. His steps were measured, sure, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. Declan walked beside him, but Marcus didn't need any company. The attention from onlookers, the murmurs and whispers, didn't faze him. He had already done what he needed to do. He had stood firm, not just for himself, but for something far bigger than this moment. And as he moved through the airport, an unsettling realization began to settle in the minds of those who had been watching. Marcus Johnson wasn't just a man who had been wrongfully detained. He was a symbol of how deeply embedded the system was, how it could take even the most innocent among us and turn them into suspects based on nothing more than assumptions. But it was too late. The world was already watching, and Marcus was no longer just a name. He was a message. Marcus stepped out into the bustling terminal, his pace measured, unhurried. The overhead lights flickered as the steady hum of the airport returned to normal. But Marcus wasn't part of that rhythm anymore. The world around him had shifted. For him, everything felt different, heightened. The surveillance cameras, the hurried steps of travelers, the hurried conversations in foreign languages, it all seemed like a blur now. His mind was focused on one thing: accountability. The crowd of onlookers that had gathered around the security office started to disperse, but not before their phones caught the image of the man in the gray coat, calmly walking alongside the man in the black overcoat. The footage was already circulating. It didn't take long for the first few videos to go viral. The caption that accompanied one of them simply read, "Is this what security looks like now?" And just like that, the story began to take on a life of its own. The world had just learned that Marcus Johnson, a world-renowned legal advisor, had been wrongfully detained based on nothing more than his appearance. But what they didn't know was what Marcus planned to do next. Declan Rodas followed closely behind, making sure to stay in step with Marcus, though the two men seemed worlds apart. Declan, despite his professionalism, felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The air between them felt thick with the unsaid. Marcus didn't speak, didn't need to. Declan was there to ensure his safe passage, to make sure the damage done to Marcus's dignity was somehow repaired. But Marcus didn't need fixing. The world needed to understand the truth. Declan had already sent a message to the UN's legal team, alerting them of the situation. And yet, in the few moments they had walked through the terminal together, it was clear that no amount of paperwork or official channels would undo what had happened. No apology, no explanation would ever take away the feeling of powerlessness Marcus had been made to feel by a system that should have been there to protect him. Marcus was led to an office on the lower level of the airport, where more officers waited. Their uniforms were crisp, their expressions neutral, but the unease was evident. As soon as Marcus walked in, the room fell silent. Every eye shifted toward him, eyes that were now seeing him in a completely different light. The same eyes that moments ago had only seen a man to arrest. Now, they saw a man with purpose. But Marcus didn't acknowledge the stares. He didn't need to. His calm presence was enough. "You're free to go," Declan said, his voice firm. "But I need to make sure the proper procedures are followed." Marcus nodded, his gaze shifting to the officers. "I expect full transparency," he said calmly. "And I want to make sure that this doesn't just end with me walking out of here. This is bigger than me." Declan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I'll make sure of it." It was then that the door opened again, and a new figure entered the room. This time, it was someone from the airport's legal department. The woman, dressed in a sharp suit, carried an air of urgency. She looked at Marcus, then at Declan, as if she were assessing the situation before speaking. "Mr. Johnson," she began, her voice slightly hesitant, "we're deeply sorry for the inconvenience. We understand that there was a mistake." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A mistake," he repeated. This was more than a mistake. It was an abuse of power. Her eyes flickered nervously, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, of course. We'll be reviewing the footage immediately, and we'll have a full report for you. The officers involved will be questioned." Marcus shook his head. "That's not enough. I don't want just an internal review. I want accountability. I want public transparency. What happened to me cannot happen to anyone else. The system that allowed this to happen needs to be examined." The woman nodded, though her unease was evident. "We'll take that into consideration. But right now, the priority is to get you out of here safely." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The words had already been spoken, and the message was clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. As he was led out of the room, he felt a strange mix of relief and determination. The tension had lifted, but the weight of the moment remained. He had been wronged, and while this moment of release from the handcuffs was important, it wasn't enough. Not for him. Not for anyone else who had ever faced the same unjust treatment. Outside the security office, Declan gave him a brief nod before stepping aside. The airport was still bustling, but now it felt like a different place. Marcus had walked through these terminals countless times before, but today they felt like a battleground. And yet, in a way, they had also become a symbol of hope. His ordeal had ignited something, a spark of awareness, and the world was starting to take notice. The news had already started to spread across social media, with people sharing their outrage at what had happened. The video of Marcus's arrest, his calm defiance in the face of wrongful detainment, had gone viral. It was more than just a video, it was a story that needed to be told. And now, Marcus would make sure that it was heard, loud and clear. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket as he walked toward the exit. Messages of support flooded in, friends, colleagues, even strangers who had seen the footage. They all offered their sympathy, their anger, and their solidarity. But Marcus didn't respond. He had a bigger mission now. The story wasn't about him. It was about the system that had wronged him, and the many others like him who had suffered in silence. As he stepped out into the fresh air, Marcus didn't look back. The moment had passed. But the work? The work was just beginning. The quiet hum of the airport faded as Marcus stepped outside into the cool New York air. The sunlight felt different today, brighter, sharper, almost symbolic of the shift that had just occurred in his life. He could hear the distant sound of car engines, the hustle of taxis pulling in and out of the terminal, but none of it mattered. Marcus wasn't focused on the world outside. His mind was set on something bigger now, something more crucial than his personal experience. His ordeal had exposed something far deeper than just one unjust arrest. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, a system that profiled, assumed, and punished based on superficial biases. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure of society itself. The policies, the procedures, the very laws that were supposed to protect people like him, people who, despite their qualifications, experiences, and contributions, could still be reduced to a threat simply because of their skin color, needed to change. As soon as Marcus left the airport, he was bombarded with messages. His phone buzzed constantly, his inbox filling with emails, texts, and social media alerts. The world had seen his arrest. The world was angry, and they were demanding accountability. But Marcus wasn't just going to wait for change. He was going to make it happen. Within hours of his release, Marcus started working on something that would ensure that no one else would have to face what he had. He had already begun drafting a proposal, an initiative designed not just to react to instances of injustice, but to prevent them from ever happening again. The Transit Justice Initiative was born out of that frustration, that desire to make sure the mistakes made against him would never happen to anyone else. It wasn't a reactionary measure. It was a blueprint for the future. It called for comprehensive oversight of airport security, clear and transparent procedures for detaining individuals, and most importantly, a system of accountability that would ensure no officer could act on bias or assumptions without scrutiny. The initiative demanded several key changes. independent audits of law enforcement actions at transportation hubs, publicly accessible complaint logs, and mandatory bias recertification for officers. It wasn't a small task, but it was necessary. Marcus had spent his life fighting for justice, for fairness, and now he was going to use his platform to ensure that this type of racial profiling would no longer be tolerated in the places people felt they were safest. While Marcus worked on the initiative, the media continued to amplify his story. News outlets ran stories on his wrongful arrest, and the footage of his detainment spread across social media, sparking conversations about racial profiling, systemic inequality, and the abuse of power. As the video reached millions of views, the public outcry grew louder. People were demanding change. They wanted to know why it was that someone like Marcus, a respected legal advisor, could be treated with such disdain and suspicion. They wanted answers, and Marcus intended to provide them. By the time the next day rolled around, the press had caught wind of his plans. Interviews poured in. Television stations, online media, even podcasts wanted his story. But Marcus wasn't interested in speaking to the press for the sake of it. He wasn't looking for sympathy or praise. His message was simple. This wasn't about his individual experience. It was about the flawed system that needed to be dismantled and rebuilt. He needed to ensure the issue wasn't just swept under the rug. As the media frenzy grew, so did the pressure. But Marcus had always worked under pressure. He had spent decades advising some of the world's most powerful institutions on human rights law. He knew the importance of strategic communication, of building momentum, and using his voice to advocate for change. This was just another challenge, one he was more than ready to take on. He began reaching out to lawmakers, human rights organizations, and legal experts, asking for their support. He knew he couldn't do this alone. But what he didn't anticipate was how quickly the world rallied behind him. His story resonated with so many victims of racial profiling, activists, and everyday people who had witnessed the injustice firsthand. His initiative quickly gained traction. The next step was to make sure the message reached the highest levels of government and law enforcement. Marcus worked tirelessly, drafting documents, sending emails, making phone calls. He knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. But this wasn't the first time he had fought for justice. It wouldn't be the last. Meanwhile, the footage of his arrest continued to gain momentum online. As the video spread, the questions grew louder. The public wanted to know how many more people like Marcus were being treated unfairly simply because of how they looked. And that was when the conversation shifted, away from just Marcus's case and onto a broader systemic issue. People were beginning to realize that this wasn't just about a single instance of racial profiling. This was happening every day in airports, in the streets, in workplaces, and in classrooms. The injustice wasn't isolated, it was pervasive. By the end of the week, Marcus was contacted by several major media outlets for an exclusive interview. The nation was watching, and he knew it. But the interviews weren't for Marcus to tell his side of the story, it was for him to put forward the solution. This was his moment to present the Transit Justice Initiative to the public. It wasn't a moment for personal vindication, it was a chance to make a lasting impact. "I'm not here for apologies," Marcus said in one of the interviews. "I'm here because this system needs to change. It's not just about me. It's about every person who's ever been wronged. And it's about time that we hold the systems in place accountable, so this doesn't happen again." The interview sparked a national conversation, with lawmakers, civil rights groups, and citizens calling for reform. Marcus's calm, steady demeanor, his unwavering belief in justice, had become a beacon for others who had been silenced for too long. And with each passing day, the momentum grew. Marcus wasn't just a victim of a broken system anymore. He had become the catalyst for change. And though the battle was far from over, the first steps had been taken. The world was watching. And Marcus Johnson was ready to lead it toward justice. The days following Marcus's release were filled with a whirlwind of phone calls, interviews, and meetings. But despite the noise, despite the pressure building all around him, Marcus remained resolute. He had done what needed to be done, and now, the hard work of ensuring that the Transit Justice Initiative became more than just a proposal, he was determined to make it a movement. Behind closed doors, things were moving quickly. Legislators, human rights organizations, and legal experts had already begun endorsing his initiative. The conversation was growing, spreading beyond just airport security to include other areas of public service and law enforcement. It was no longer just about racial profiling at airports. It was about systemic change in the very structure of how society viewed and treated people of color. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. He couldn't rest now, not with the momentum that had been built. There was too much at stake, too much that needed to be fixed. He had spent his life fighting for human rights, but now the fight was closer to home than ever before. It wasn't just some far-off injustice he could look at from the outside. It was his own experience, and he would not let it be forgotten. His office was filled with drafts, proposals, and legal briefs, papers that would eventually form the foundation for real change. He had recruited a small but powerful team of lawyers, activists, and civil rights advocates, all united by the same cause. Together, they worked tirelessly, reviewing data, collecting testimonies, and pushing for action. But Marcus knew that the real battle wouldn't be won in the offices of lawmakers. It would be won in the streets, in the hearts and minds of everyday people. It would be won by those who had been silenced, those whose stories had never been told. And that's why he decided to take the next step, to give them a voice. The Baptist Center for Public Truth was born out of that need. It wasn't just an organization, it was a platform, a sanctuary for those whose voices had been silenced by the very systems meant to protect them. It would be dedicated to ensuring that the stories of those wronged by racial profiling and unjust detainments didn't fade into obscurity. And just as Marcus had been the catalyst for change, the center would provide the tools for others to join in the fight for justice. The day the center launched, Marcus stood in front of a crowd of activists, journalists, and legal experts. The building behind him was modern and sleek, but it was what the center stood for that mattered most. It was a beacon for those who had been ignored, a place where their stories would be heard. And with its launch, Marcus knew the fight for accountability had gained its most powerful tool. The Transit Justice Initiative is just the beginning, Marcus said, his voice carrying a sense of purpose that reverberated through the room. This is not about me. It's not about one incident at an airport. It's about the hundreds, the thousands, the millions of people who have been subjected to the same treatment, day after day, without anyone noticing. We have the power to change that. We have the power to demand better. As he spoke, the audience was silent, hanging on every word. For some, it was the first time they had heard someone articulate the issue with such clarity. For others, it was a call to arms, a reminder that the fight was far from over. But for Marcus, it was just one more step in a long journey. The center's first major initiative was to launch the Silenced Files, an archive of civilian accounts from people who had been wrongfully detained, profiled, or stopped simply because of their skin color. The stories within it weren't sensationalized. They were raw, honest, and gut-wrenching. But they were also a testament to resilience, to the quiet strength of those who had endured the unimaginable. Each person's story was a piece of the larger puzzle that Marcus was determined to solve. The center would not only collect stories, it would use them to fuel advocacy, to push for policy change, and to hold those in power accountable. And the more stories they gathered, the more the movement grew. Marcus didn't stop there. He didn't just want to fight for change, he wanted to teach others how to do it. 2. He began a series of public lectures, speaking to law students, community leaders, and anyone who would listen. He taught them how to challenge the systems that were meant to protect, but instead often oppress. He taught them that justice wasn't just a word, it was a practice. And it was one that had to be fought for every single day. It wasn't long before the world began to take notice. News outlets were picking up the story, politicians were taking action, and citizens were rallying behind the cause. The momentum was building, and it was unstoppable. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It wasn't in the praise or recognition. The real victory was in the people who were speaking out, those who had once been too afraid to share their stories, who had been silenced by fear or doubt. They were no longer alone. They were part of something bigger. And as Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium one evening, listening to the questions from the next generation of activists and lawyers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done it, not alone, but with the support of so many others who shared his vision. The work was far from over, but he had made a dent. And that dent, over time, would grow into a crack, one that no amount of power could silence. The movement was no longer just a quiet revolution. It was loud. It was strong. It was unstoppable. And it had only just begun.